Your dungeon master has placed you in a dreadfully precarious position. You're playing the most phenomenal game ever created. Your skin grows cold from your first glimpse of the enormous beast. It's a product of your imagination. Survival depends on a quick, decisive move. Your choices are limited. Stand and fight, or run. Use your lightning bolt. Victory is yours.
Win the treasure.
TSR Hobbies, Dungeons & Dragons games. Products of your imagination.
Sometimes I'll make a video and it kind of just snowballs into another video. And in this case, it was the result of a comment. In my video regarding Magic the Gathering and Wizards of the Coast's little incident with printing way too many frickin' cards and almost destroying themselves, someone asked, hey, I thought Wizards of the Coast made Dungeons & Dragons. And no, well, yes, but also no. Wizards has only had control of Dungeons & Dragons since 1997, and have created the modern editions of it, starting with 3rd edition. But they didn't create Dungeons & Dragons, nor were they in the initial publisher. They bought the original publisher in 1997, after the success of Magic did wind up making them a lot of money, and they could invest in, well, buy other nerdy things that they also liked. The original publisher was TSR Incorporated, and their story is wild!
Mazes and Monsters is a far-out game.
With betrayal and subterfuge and drama and all things related to Dungeons & Dragons. And just to be clear, in case you don't know, Dungeons & Dragons is a fantasy tabletop role-playing game, TTRPG, created and designed by Gygax and Dave Arneson, originally published in 1974. Dungeons & Dragons is still played by many today, and in fact it's arguably more popular than it ever was, as when it was first introduced it was mostly reserved for quiet nerds who didn't like talking to people like me, and now a lot of regular people will also play D&D on occasion. Personally, I haven't played D&D in a long time. I don't dislike D&D, but I've had some bad experiences, not due to the game, just due to the people. It's always the people's fault. People ruin everything. Do you see why I don't talk to people? Anyway, the publication of Dungeons & Dragons is recognized as the beginning of modern role-playing game and the role-playing game industry as a whole, influencing many other forms of media, particularly video games, like Baldur's Gate. You guys like Baldur's Gate 3? Yeah, so did I. Anywho, but wherever there's a game to be sold, there's a business behind it, because that's how these things work. Okay, you don't get your media without someone looking to sell it to you. And the company that published it was created specifically to sell Dungeons & Dragons. See, Gary Gygax, we're finding it difficult to actually find a publisher for Dungeons & Dragons. No one really took the game seriously. It was strange for the time, as it was a new thing. So Gary got with a childhood friend of his named Kaye, and in 1973 formed Tactical Studies Rules, or just TSR. Gary and Don both had a long history when it came to tabletop games, just not ones like D&D. When they were kids, they loved playing board games, and really enjoyed miniature war games, involving tiny figurines and actual armies you move around, and Warhammer 40k. It's the modern version of what we're discussing at the moment. Though back then there was no Warhammer, it was a lot of actual soldiers, like based off of real world events, like World War I and World War II, stuff like that. But either way, it was fun for them. And they got creative with it. They had rich imaginations, creating even storylines behind their miniatures. And Gygax himself was active in the wargame hobby world, even as an adult. By 1966, he was writing many magazine articles on the subject, and in 1967 he co-founded the International Federation of Wargamers, or IFW, along with Bill Spear and Scott Duncan. It was a small venture, just a club of people who liked these kinds of games, though theirs grew quite a bit. And eventually, Gygax would organize a 20-person gaming meeting in the basement of his own home, with this event later being called Gen Con Zero. Gen Con is the largest tabletop gaming convention in North America by both attendance and number of events. It's still active now. Officially established in 1968 as the Lake Geneva War Games Convention by Gygax. So in case it wasn't obvious, Gygax in particular was extremely influential when it came to all things exceedingly nerdy. And underneath the original version of Gen Con, Gygax and Robert Kuntz would found the Castle and Crusade Society of IFW, focusing on more medieval miniature war games. But in 1970, Gygax lost his job. He'd been working at an insurance company for 9 years, and now he was unemployed and had 5 children with his wife. So that was a problem. He opted to try to make a living designing board games for commercial sale. And while he was having fun with it, that was not sustainable. Unable to find actual work, he started cobbling shoes in his basement, which did provide a more steady income and gave him time to continue his hobby of game development. In 1971, he managed to get a job doing some editing work at Guidon Games. Or Guidon Games? I'm not quite sure how do you pronounce it. They were a publisher of war games, and for them, he produced the board games Alexander the Great and Dunkirk, the Battle of France. He also published a game called Chainmail, a miniatures war game that simulated medieval-era tactical combat. The first edition of Chainmail included a fantasy supplement to the rules, comprising a system for warriors, wizards, and other non-human stuff, drawn from the works of Tolkien. Chainmail was pretty successful, all things considered, for the smaller publisher, and Dave Arneson briefly adapted the rules for Chainmail for his fantasy Blackmoor campaign. In the winter of 1972 and 1973, both Arneson and a friend, David McGarry, who invented a board game called Dungeon, with an exclamation point, traveled to Lake Geneva to showcase their respective games to Gygax, and Gygax liked both of them. In particular, he liked Arneson's role-playing game, the elements he thought were really cool, and they immediately started collaborating on creating the fantasy game, as it was originally known, which would eventually become Dungeons & Dragons. With the initial version of D&D finalized, Gygax would ask his own employer to publish it, but the game included a 3-volume rule set in a labeled box that the publisher just couldn't handle. It was a lot. So he went to Avalon Hill and pitched the game, but they didn't understand the idea. It didn't make any sense to them, so they said no. But Gygax really thought he had something here, so he left his employer in 1973, and in October of that year, along with Don Kaye as his partner, founded Tactical Studies Rules specifically to publish Dungeons & Dragons. Each of them invested $1,000 into the venture, with Kaye borrowing his share of his life insurance policy in order to do this, and that amount of money allowed them to print 1,000 copies of the Dungeons & Dragons box set. Though Dungeons & Dragons wasn't the first thing they released under Tactical Studies rules. Originally, to drum up early capital, they started with a pre-made game, a miniatures game called Cavaliers and Roundheads. But that game didn't sell really all that well, so that wasn't helpful. So, in order to fix this, they brought in another man named Brian Bloom in December of 1973, who was willing to fund further publishing of D&D because, again, Cavaliers and Roundheads wasn't selling. In the original version of the company, Kaye was the president, Bloom was vice president, and Gygax was just the editor. He actually wasn't managing anything. He was just handling the game itself. In January of 1974, TSR, which was headquartered in Gygax's basement, again, he does a lot in his basement. But they were able to finally produce the 1,000 copies of D&D, selling them for $10 each, as well as the required extra dice for another $3.50. In total, that's about $88 in today's money, a little more than that due to inflation, so yeah. But people really liked it. It was cool. It was an interesting idea. We could pretend and sit there and play a game with each other, go on a magic quest in our own heads. Magical! The first print sold out in 10 months. In January of 1975, they printed a second batch of another 1,000 copies, which only took another 5 or 6 months to sell out. Word was spreading. People were more interested in playing the game and more interested in getting a hold of their own copy of the book. Additionally, in 1974, they also published Warriors of Mars, which was a miniatures rulebook set in the fantasy world of Barsoom, originally imagined by Edgar Rice Burroughs in his John Carter of Mars series, which Gygax was a big fan of. But the thing was, Gygax and by extension TSR didn't actually get permission from the Burroughs estate to do that? So, yeah, what do you know? So they were forced to drop that and never reprinted it. And on January 31st, 1975, the company would be met with tragedy, with one of the original founders, Don Kaye, suffering from a sudden heart attack and dying as a result. His wife, Donna, would step in to help the company following her husband's death, handling accounting, shipping, and the records of the partnership through the summer. But as the company continued to grow, it went beyond her scope, so Gygax himself became a full-time employee of the partnership in order to take over those duties from Donna. Both Brian Bloom and Gary Gygax would opt to reorganize the business into a corporation called TSR Hobbies Incorporated. Still TSR, but no longer Tactical Studies Rules, just TSR. That was the official name. This was originally designed as a separate company to market miniatures and games by other companies, and was connected to the opening of the Dungeon Hobby Shop in Lake Geneva. But they opted to let TSR Hobbies just buy out the old TSR partnership's assets because it was easier from a financial and tax and everything perspective. They were just like, whatever. And Brian's own father, Melvin Bloom, would personally invest $20,000, which enabled them to buy out Donna Kaye's share of the original partnership. In this new form, Brian Bloom would become the largest shareholder, Melvin Bloom was the second largest, and Gygax himself was the third largest. Gygax was made the president of the company, with the junior Bloom as vice president and secretary. The new hobby shop was basically their headquarters, and they would subcontract the printing and assembly work in October of 1975, resulting in a third run of D&D, a total of 2,000 copies, which sold out in 5 months. The first brand new game product released by TSR Hobbies was Empire of the Petal Throne, followed up by 2 D&D supplement products, Greyhawk and Blackmore. They also released that board game I mentioned before, Dungeon, and a Wild West RPG known as Boot Hill. They were able to take in $300,000 in revenues for the fiscal year of 1976. They were starting to take off, and they started hosting the Gen Con Game Fair that same year, with the first D&D Open Tournament being held. In 76, they would release more D&D supplements, Eldritch, Wizardry, and Gods, Demigods, and Heroes. They then started dividing the Dungeons & Dragons product into 2 individual products. Dungeons & Dragons, regular D&D, as a general audience product intended for novices. And then there was AD&D, Advanced Dungeons & Dragons. Oh, this isn't just regular D&D. This is Advanced D&D. It was a more complicated product aimed at the truly hardcore fans. In 1977, the Dungeons & Dragons Basic Set was released for the game, and the Monster Manual was also released as the initial product for Advanced D&D. And that made TSR the first game company to publish a hardbound book, which you wouldn't think would be I guess someone had to be first, but it's weird that it took that long, you know? In 78, the AD&D Player's Handbook was published, followed by a series of 6 adventure modules. However, this wasn't the first time where the TSR got a little questionable in terms of their business practices. Whether this was Bloom's idea or Gygax, Gygax almost had to know. Basically, Dave Arneson, one of the co-creators of D&D, remember, got no royalties on the advanced D&D products, because they said, his co-creation rights extended to the base D&D name only. Okay, that's an interesting take. I don't know if I agree with that. And Arneson would file suit to retain credits and royalties on the game in 1979. That year was when the AD&D Dungeon Master's Guide was published, with radio ads being played featuring Morley the Wizard, which was a figure created to offer a more child-friendly image. Regardless of which book we're talking about, all those core books for D&D were pretty big hits. The basic set in particular would sell over 100,000 copies in 79. But the creation of D&D and the success of D&D had resulted in competition, because that's how this works. This is a free market. Anybody can all of a sudden be like, oh, that's a great idea. I'm gonna make my own version and compete with you. It wasn't just direct competitors either. There were also a bunch of unofficial supplements to D&D. And when it came to the latter, TSR had to play things really carefully, because they weren't so big that they weren't out of touch with their player base. and they recognized that players were actually using the supplemented material regardless of the fact that they were violating TSR's copyright. And if they were to, sue them and do something ridiculous, that would be their right, but it would also upset their players, and they were like, it's one of those situations where it's like, okay, how do we handle this? If it was a minor thing, something that was technically a violation but not really a misuse of their trademarks, they opted to ignore it. But if it was a flagrant misuse of their trademarks, they would issue cease and desist letters. They wouldn't directly sue, they would tell you to knock it off. Generally, that was enough to result in slight changes to the competitor's works to avoid getting sued. But even though TSR was, frankly, being really fair about this, all things considered, the nerdy community is, nerdy, and tends to overreact about stuff like this. You see this all the time, even now, especially online. The community didn't appreciate that TSR was bullying other smaller creators. How dare you do this, even though the other smaller creators were literally ripping off TSR and using their stuff without their... It's one of those frustrating elements of something like D&D, because a big part of D&D is creating your own story and, crafting your own plot elements and threads and other sort of things and all this stuff. But at the same time, the core elements, the baseline that TSR gave players to do this is effectively theirs in terms of copyright. So you can't just go doing whatever without causing problems, but then the players are like, yeah, but this is about openness and community. And what are you, a capitalist? To which TSR is like, we are a corporation. Yes, what is wrong with you? How do you think this thing got sold to begin with? It's 1979. Go check with the Soviets. They don't have D&D. You know why? Because they're filthy communists. Anyway, unfortunately for them, the internet wasn't a thing back then. So word of this kind of stuff usually was through word of mouth. Therefore, it wasn't a massive social media explosion of controversy. It was just, hey, can't believe TSR would do this. Now roll for initiative. It was one of those things. In 1979, TSR would sign a contract with Random House, one of the largest publishing houses in the United States. Obviously, this was a big deal for them and a lucrative venture, but the terms of the agreement were actually really weird. Here's how this worked. In most deals with publishers and distributors, TSR is the publisher, Random House is the distributor in this case, just to be clear. Publishers are paid directly based on books sold downstream by the distributor to the bookstores, right? TSR's contract didn't work like this. In this instance, Random House would loan the money to TSR as an advance upon shipment of product from TSR to Random House. Not after that. The loan was equivalent to about 27.3% of the suggested retail price. I know that sounds really weird, because it is, but it was a mutually beneficial arrangement at the time. This allowed TSR, which was still relatively small, to acquire money up front to fund future works, and not have to worry about immediate sales. As far as Random House's side, TSR's products had really consistent sales over time, with returns rather low, meaning Random House was pretty confident they would make money even though they were giving money up front to TSR. And indeed, at first, this was great for both. It would become relevant later, and a serious problem, but that's for a few decades from now. We're still talking about the early days. Gygax would opt to grant exclusive rights to the Games Workshop, a British manufacturer of miniature war games based in Nottingham, England, to distribute TSR products in the United Kingdom. Games Workshop opted to print some original material and their own versions of the various D&D and AD&D titles, and that was to avoid high import costs. Both companies had a pretty good working relationship, and for a time were talking about merging, but they couldn't come to an agreement on that. So TSR opted to create a subsidiary, TSR Hobbies UK Limited, in 1980, with Gygax hiring Don Turnbull to lead that. That subsidiary would be able to expand into continental Europe during the 80s, publishing even more games as well as more Dungeons & Dragons. The first published campaign setting for AD&D, known as the World of Greyhawk, was introduced in 1980. They also pushed a espionage RPG known as Top Secret. Shh! Don't tell anyone! It's all classified! And the Role Playing Game Association was founded to promote skillful role-playing and unite players around the country. Oh boy, get to unite with other players, which means I have to talk to other players. This is why I don't play D&D anymore. I don't want to do that at all. But all this was great success for TSR. They were considered among the fastest growing privately held US companies of the early 80s, and they broke the 20 million sales mark in 1982. D&D was very, very popular, and they had enough money where they could start making the miniatures they were creating for AD&D in-house. Originally, they had used Grenadier miniatures for that, but they terminated the license to just start doing it themselves, and started making toys. D&D was always their bread and butter, but they had more games out there, like Gangbusters and Star Frontiers. And in terms of what was going on when it came to the management, well, in the early 80s things were okay, though Melvin Bloom's shares were to be transferred to his son Kevin Bloom. When that happened, the leadership of TSR consisted of Kevin and Brian Bloom, the Bloom brothers, if you will, as well as Gygax. Gygax would say that the three were a team, and only proceeded with unanimous consent and buy-in. But this story given by Gygax would change over time. In much later interviews, when he was more bitter and angry after how all this went, he would say that he was a powerless figurehead, with the Blooms doing everything without him. Now, this is going to be a difficult topic for me to discuss, because a lot of people defend Gygax and want to side with him because he is one of the granddaddies of D&D, and he is a god amongst mere nerds, and he is a cherished and celebrated figure when it comes to the underground tabletop culture. But I am talking about the functional elements of the business and the truth. And the truth is, Gygax is like everybody else. He's not a perfect person. And he might have kind of sort of possibly said a lot of things that weren't necessarily true, but we'll get to that. But in the early 80s, things were fine. Revenue was high, the company was growing, and everything was okay. They also started diversifying by purchasing or starting new commercial ventures to generate more media, even adding an entertainment division to explore getting into films and television. Though not every acquisition and expansion was necessarily a good idea. See, one of the things they got a hold of was Greenfield Needlewomen, which was a needlecraft business. It was owned by a cousin of the Blooms, and it's likely, if not guaranteed, that they only got it because their cousin asked them to. They did produce D&D themed needlecraft, but this was this wasn't the thing. This was not the thing that was gonna sell. The kind of people that played D&D at the time were not really into the whole needlecraft thing. It just wasn't something they were down for. It was a complete failure and waste of money, being criticized as nepotism, which is, again, probably correct. Additionally, their hiring practices were also somewhat questionable due to the whole nepotism thing. Then this applies to both the Blooms and Gygax. Generally, they favored friends and relatives of theirs when it came to bringing people into the company. They would also wind up using company funds to raise a shipwreck from Geneva Lake because they felt like it. And okay, as someone who talks about vehicle history and stuff, yeah, if I had a lot of money, I'd probably be salvaging something ridiculous too. But also, you shouldn't use company funds to do it, because why did you do that? It doesn't apply to D&D at all. And they also acquired the trademark and copyrights of a magazine called Amazing Stories, even though that mag only had 10,000 subscribers. They might have just wanted to do it just because they happened to be one of the subscribers, who knows? They were kind of behaving in a way that reminds me of what happens when you just kind of give someone a bunch of money with no clear instructions or restrictions. If you just hand someone $10 million, let's say I handed you $10 million, what would you do with it? Now, most of us probably say, oh, I'd invest it here and I'd pay off my debts. And okay, stop. It's easy to say that. But let's be fair about this. Most of us are not actually equipped when it comes to the education and foresight and experience that comes with managing that amount of money. We might start spending it willy-nilly and not know when to stop. and put it into stuff we shouldn't spend it on because, hey, it's 10 million. It'll last forever. No, it won't. It will run out. It is a finite, definite amount. And I feel like that's kind of what was going on when it comes to TSR at this point, with both the Blooms and Gygax. They're probably like, oh, I like that thing. We're making a lot of money. Let's just get it. What the heck with it? Just get it here. Oh, my cousin needs someone to buy her business. Well, just get it. Yeah, sure, needlecraft. It might work. Who knows? Who cares? Like, they weren't really thinking strategically or logically. They were just doing things because they wanted to. And on one hand, they're allowed to do that as a privately held company because they didn't have to worry about investors at this point. So, I mean, it's kind of hard to say you can't do that when you're only damaging yourself. But also, it wasn't a good idea from a business running perspective. But some of the investments were at least somewhat logical. They tried to get into war games. Remember, Gygax had a long-standing history since he was a kid with war games, so of course he wanted to sell war games, and they were able to push another acquisition in 1982 with the takeover of Simulations Publications Incorporated, or SPI. And the takeover was one of the most hilariously toxic things I've ever seen in business. Here's how this worked. SPI was heavily in debt at the time, so TSR was like, hey, good buddy, old pal, we're gonna give you a promissory note for several $100,000, and they would allow SPI to use their assets as collateral. SPI would proceed to immediately use that money to pay off their debts, leaving them in a very cash-poor situation, but debt-free. Without the debts to worry about, they could, take the time, make the money back, repay TSR, all would be fine. Except less than 2 weeks after they did it, TSR called the note, and with SPI having no cash on hand, they were forced to hand over everything they had to TSR. Yo! Gygax! Blooms! That's cruel and unusual, but hey! Though in some ways this was kind of a good thing, since SPI had been sitting on a bunch of titles that they wanted to release but didn't have the money for. TSR would immediately set about releasing those titles, like Battle Over Britain and A Gleam of Bayonets. They would also rebox and republish several popular SPI titles from the mid-70s under their logo. However, TSR didn't think about what they were doing when it came to acquiring SPI. They did it, again, because they wanted to. They liked war games. Gygax liked war games, and he thought everyone else loved war games. But the problem was, by the mid-80s, the war game market had collapsed, partially due to the existence of role-playing games like Dungeons & Dragons. That was the reason SPI was in so much debt from the get-go, and TSR magically coming in with money and throwing the games out there wasn't gonna make them sell. People just weren't buying these kinds of games anymore. And when sales fell flat, TSR halted all new game projects, which caused the SPI game devs to resign and move to a rival company called Avalon Hill. TSR still toyed with some war games and did wind up with at least one hit, involving The Hunt for Red October, published in 1988, but just 10 years after they took over SPI, they completely abandoned the war game market. The Hunt for Red October was pretty much their only success during this outing. In '83, TSR was technically split into 4 distinct companies. TSR Incorporated, the primary successor, TSR International, TSR Ventures, and TSR Entertainment. Gygax was the one who was sent to deal with the entertainment division. He went to Hollywood and tried to start licensing D&D products to movie and television executives. But his work only led to a single license, which would later become the Dungeons & Dragons cartoon. Granted, despite being the only success, it was a success, actually. It was the lead program in its time slot for 2 years and ran for 3 seasons. It was critically acclaimed. Meanwhile, TSR Incorporated started publishing the Dragonlance saga in 1984, which had been in development for 2 years at that point. That series was both a set of modules and supplements designed for running campaigns in an entirely new game world, as well as a series of novels, written by Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman. The novels, in particular, were a huge hit. Dragonlance was awesome, with Dragons of the Autumn Twilight, the first novel in the series, reaching the top of the New York Times bestseller list. This encouraged TSR to launch a long series of paperback novels, leading to even more sales, and TSR's books department was one of the most profitable divisions. Their increased foothold in the entertainment industry allowed them to start making contracts with other companies to publish other people's licenses. This included Marvel superheroes, Indiana Jones, and Conan role-playing games. They also tried to diversify away from just the RPG tabletop games to a wider audience and start pushing family board games. This included All My Children, a board game based on ABC's daytime soap opera, which did sell 150,000 copies, and Crosscheck, which was basically a combination of Scrabble and crossword puzzles. By 1985, Gen Con had become so big that Lake Geneva was no longer large enough for it, so they relocated to Milwaukee, Wisconsin. The Oriental Adventures hardback for AD&D was released that same year, becoming the biggest seller for 1985. And in 1986, they started publishing the bi-monthly Dragon Adventures magazine, featuring adventure scenarios for Dungeons & Dragons, regular D&D. However, in the background, things were not going so well for TSR. It looked good to the untrained eye, but there were problems. See, one of the big issues when it comes to selling a tabletop RPG is once people have it, they don't really need you anymore. This is especially the case in a book format. In fact, this can apply to any book. Once you buy a book, you have a book. It's a physical book with pages and words, and you can read it anytime, forever. The seller of the book can't knock on your door and be like, yeah, can I get that back? That doesn't happen. That's a digital media thing. This is physical media. And once you have it, it's yours. And the problem with this is that, well, D&D as a thing kind of stopped growing for a while. The people that wanted it already had it. As a result, sales of the core rule books and box sets crested in 1983, falling in 84 and 85. Simply put, everyone already had them, so they weren't going to buy them again. And while the expansions did help a bit, they could only make those so fast. The success of Dragonlance was a good thing, and that helped too, but remember, TSR had been spending money willy-nilly on a bunch of stupid nonsense that never turned up anything, just because they felt like it. That meant that, financially, they were in horrible shape, and had to start a cycle of layoffs. The Blooms would negotiate a $4 million loan from the American National Bank to keep operations going while they figured out what they were doing wrong. This caused a lot of drama behind the scenes among the suits. TSR's line of credit was stopped by their bank, and their debt had ballooned to over $1.5 million. Gygax would later claim that he didn't know how bad the financial situation was because he was in Hollywood. Some questioned Gygax's claim, saying he probably did know a bit more than he said, but he still probably didn't quite fully grasp how bad it was because it took until '85 to come back. That spring, he exercised an option to buy 700 shares of TSR stock himself, which combined with shares that had been given to his own son, Ernie, gave him 51.1% of all stock, much higher than the 30% he had before. Gygax then faced off with the board of directors and forced the removal of the Bloom brothers, with him solely in control of TSR. And if I stop the story there, that's great. Yes! The Lord of Nerds is now in control! Surely he will right the situation. No. Gygax did nothing to fix the problems. Well, he tried, but he wasn't really that great at this. Nothing he did, none of his ideas really panned out to much. The financial difficulties remained even without the Blooms. Within a year of their departure, they posted a net loss of $1.5 million, meaning they had to lay off 75% of their staff. Many of those who were laid off went to form other game companies, competitors, like Pacesetter Limited, Mayfair Games, or to work at Coleco in their video game department. Gygax struggled to search for more financing because he was trying to do his best here in a bad situation. Not everything that happened was his fault necessarily, but some of it was. In fact, I personally remain 100% convinced that taking over SPI was totally his idea, but that's just me. Regardless, he had a contact back in Hollywood named Flint Dial, and he suggested bringing on his own sister, named Lorraine Williams. Gygax, desperate, decided to give Lorraine a shot. She was given the position of general manager at TSR, and did set about fixing their terrible situation. And to be fair, okay, look, Lorraine Williams, partially due to Gygax constantly saying so, is often portrayed as a villain here. This element is also not quite correct. I mean, it's not outright wrong. She did do some things that were wrong, and mistakes were made by her. But, spoiler, she did fix TSR for a while. However, her techniques, her ideas, Gygax didn't like them. Which is annoying to me, from the outside looking in, and gazing at the story from retrospect because, Gygax, your ideas haven't been working. The company is about to go under. Just let Williams try. But they were constantly at each other's throats. Gygax didn't like a lot of her ideas and pushed back pretty hard. The Blooms were also still somewhat involved, not because they had any management say, but they still had their shares in the company. They hadn't sold them at that point. But they were worried about the recovery. They didn't think TSR was going to bounce back, so they decided they wanted to just cash out their shares and walk away. They offered to sell them to Gygax, but he said no, so they said okay, and they proceeded to purchase 700 more shares and then sell the whole thing to Williams. Williams then bought herself 50 more shares, and with those purchases, she became the majority shareholder of TSR. She was able to use that new authority and voting power to depose Gygax and CEO on October 22nd, 1985, which Gygax tried to challenge in court, but there was nothing he could do. She didn't do anything illegal. Supporters of him considered the Blooms' sale an act of retaliation, which... Yeah, that's exactly what it was. That's not play. That's totally what they did here. I'm not gonna pretend like that wasn't the case, because that's exactly what they were doing. But Gygax had been the one to force them out, so they were like, okay, we can do that. And remember, they had offered to sell their shares to him first, and he said no. So alright! After failing in court, he eventually sold his remaining stock to Williams, and then used that capital to form a competitor to TSR, known as New Infinities Productions. He was going to take on his old company, rise from the ashes, take back what was rightfully his, and that company failed by 1989. Yeah, that didn't go so well. In his defense, it probably didn't help that TSR would constantly throw legal threats at him to deter him from competing with them in the area of role-playing games, but that never really seemed to stop him. He did give it an honest try, he just failed. And now we're in the Lorraine Williams era. And again, Williams is often portrayed as a villain when it comes to a lot of TSR retrospectives. But she did save the company here. And a lot of her decisions, especially early on, were good ones. Not all of them. And the company would fail under her. But she kept them afloat for a pretty good amount of time. Williams had seen potential in rebuilding the company into a highly profitable one, but she had a reputation as a non-gamer. Someone who didn't understand what it was like in these hardcore basements. But a lot of that reputation came from Gygax constantly talking crap about her. The truth was, actual employees of TSR who worked with Lorraine, most of them said that they were fine with her. A lot even said they preferred working under her because she knew how to manage a company, which Gygax wasn't exactly great at. Under her, TSR would go on to release the Forgotten Realms campaign setting in 1987, which would be one of the most popular settings for D&D. In '88, they released The Hunt for Red October, their only successful war game, remember? And in 1989, Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 2nd Edition was released, which saw a brand new Dungeon Master's Guide, a player's handbook, and the first 3 volumes of the new Monstrous Compendium. A new campaign setting, Spelljammer, was also released in '89. 2nd Edition got a ton of different expansions, and was a very big success. In 1990, they released Ravenloft, a horror-themed setting for Advanced Dungeons & Dragons, which was a great friggin' idea, by the way. And it was based off of, well, Ravenloft, which had been introduced as a 1983 adventure module, not a full setting. This was a full setting, and people really liked it. In '91, they gave everyone the Dark Sun campaign setting, which was a more dark fantasy element. And as you can see, what they're doing here is actually providing a very varied bunch of different settings for players to work with. In '92, they released Al-Qadim, a Middle Eastern style setting. In '93, they released a revised version of the Forgotten Realms. In '93, they released Dragon Strike, an introductory product aimed at recruiting new role players, which was again another really great idea, alongside another introductory product, First Quest. Williams also wanted TSR to push into other fields, like magazines, paperback fiction, comic books, and collectible games. She continued their focus on books because that's where they made a ton of money. Though on the side, Williams would make one key decision that she's often mocked for, And, yeah, that's actually fair. Lorraine Williams was a part of the Dial Family Trust, and they had the rights to the Buck Rogers license. Buck Rogers is a sci-fi adventure hero, dating back to 1929. Williams personally wanted TSR to produce more Buck Rogers tie-in material because her family already owned it. And that meant that TSR would indeed publish a bunch of Buck Rogers board games, novels, a comic book, role-playing game, all based off of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 2nd edition rules, and every single one of these were commercial failures, because by the early 90s, no one gave a crap about Buck Rogers, Lorraine! That was the problem! In the late 80s, they opened a new West Coast division in Southern California to develop various projects in the entertainment industry, which was not the same, but similar to how Gygax had been trying to get deals in Hollywood. But this incarnation was actually less successful than Gygax had been. Remember, Gygax had gotten only one license, but that one license was successful. This new division was actually a detriment to the company. They managed to make an arrangement with DC Comics for them to produce the comics Advanced Dungeons & Dragons and Forgotten Realms, which was a good partnership. They sold well and were profitable for both companies. But TSR decided that they wanted to produce comics themselves as a stepping stool to get to television and film. Comics were cheaper to produce, and they could do it themselves. However, they already made an arrangement with DC. And if they started making their own comics, well, DC wasn't going to like that. So they decided to get creative and said, it's okay. We can get around this. They called their new product Comics Modules. They're not comics, you see. They're comics modules, which are completely different and definitely not at all just comics. We promise. They included game-related material at the end of each issue, which is how they said it was different. They also largely sold them through bookshops and not comic shops. But this idea was an awful one because it failed both commercially as well as not angering DC. To begin with, DC wasn't stupid. Once they saw what they had made, they were like, that's just a comic book. No, it's a comics book. Shut up. You think we don't know what a comic book is? We're named Detective Comics, you stooges! DC was so mad that they immediately stopped production of both the Advanced Dungeons & Dragons and Forgotten Realms comics and canceled a then-in-production Ravenloft series. Commercially, the comics modules failed too because the general audience either didn't know they existed because they weren't sold in actual comic shops, but also didn't understand what they were. Because they weren't labeled comics. Like, is this a comic? Is this something else? Like, what are these? Well, if I don't know what it is, I'm not going to buy it. Like, that's kind of how this went. TSR West would close down in 1991. In the meantime, they also continued to own and operate Gen Con, which had grown beyond its initial focus on just D&D and war games to just fans of fantasy, role-playing games in general, like anything. It was a growing convention and was very successful. It broke every previous record in attendance in 1992. And 93 is when Wizards of the Coast released Magic the Gathering, demonstrating it at Gen Con. That was a smash hit, as we've already established in the previous video about them. And TSR saw this, realizing that collectible card games were the new hot thing, they were gonna make their own. Spellfire, released in April of 1994 and discontinued by 1996. Sorry. Yeah, Spellfire didn't take off, basically at all. Part of the problem was that it was only made on a shoestring budget. They didn't give them hardly any money for it, to the point that they reused art that TSR already had commissioned for other projects. Lorraine Williams didn't like the project either, feeling that it would be a waste of time and money, but she did recognize Magic's success, so they thought giving it a try couldn't hurt. In terms of how Spellfire really did, it's, well, there's two stories. Either it failed miserably, or it sold well based off of the constraints that were on it. In my opinion, both are true. It didn't sell well. But if you factor in all the limitations they were forced to deal with, it sold better than you would think. So honestly, if they had actually invested the time and money into this thing, it actually might have been a legitimate competitor to Magic. But because they barely tried, not allowing the team to actually make something genuinely good here, well, of course it was going to fail. Instead, they focused on a different idea. Something released in 1995, and not a collectible card game. No, no, no. Dragon Dice. Yeah. Oh boy. Dragon Dice is not a collectible card game, it's a collectible dice game. Still technically produced today, and is one of only a handful of these collectible dice games, as they've never been particularly popular, at least not to the level that collectible card games are. TSR felt that Dragon Dice was going to be the next hot commodity and put a ton of effort into promoting it and pushing it, and the first sets, in their defense, did sell well at game stores, causing TSR to invest more into producing expansions to it. But Dragon Dice didn't have the staying power Magic the Gathering did. It was fun for a bit, but people often didn't pick it up and play it again after a while. Interest waned significantly. They tried to aggressively market it in mass market bookstores through Random House, but it just didn't catch on through the book trade at all, no matter how hard TSR tried to make it so. And disastrously, their book division ran into problems in the mid-90s. Remember, that was one of their big moneymakers, and suddenly they were having issues? Oh, that's good. That's wonderful. We're gonna have a great time, aren't we? Not only had they gotten into disputes with a lot of the core authors that had crafted some of their best books, but they also had overexpanded. They had started producing a ton of hardcover novels every single year, up to 12, which they used to only do 2. Now the concept was, if we produce 12, they'll all sell really well, and we'll make even more money. Or, none of them will sell well because you've oversaturated your own market. And a lot of times these books were being sold at a loss, and they kept producing Dragon Dice, which literally nobody was buying. TSR had a bunch of unsold Dragon Dice just sitting. By 96, they were experiencing serious problems that even Williams was having trouble navigating through. She had steered them out of their initial problems, that's true, and you can't take that away from her. But by now, she was the one making mistakes, and the economic situation wasn't good for them. A lot of the distributors, the stores, had actually gone out of business during the mid-90s, partially due to that big comics crash I talked about a while back. Remember that? Yeah, that didn't help TSR because, well, some of their stuff was sold through those stores too. They had nothing to do with the comics crash, just to be clear, but it didn't help them. Plus, the additional supplements for Dungeons & Dragons, Advanced and Regular, had caused a problem that they didn't foresee in that it had kind of unbalanced the game. It affected long-term viability because there were so many options now. It was kind of its own beast and out of their control. And they had developed so many new settings that, they were cannibalizing themselves. Some people were only interested in certain settings, so they would only buy those. Or they couldn't afford to buy everything, so they just chose the one they thought would look the coolest, and that was it. Regardless, they were producing this stuff based off of expectant sales, and not receiving as many sales as they thought they would. All these new settings would also cause a bit of tribalism among D&D players. Certain players are those kinds of players, and they would only play a certain setting. This divided a lot of the fan base, who went their own way, playing the kind of D&D they wanted to, but that also meant there were fewer players buying all the settings. And a post-mortem examination of TSR's finances showed that a lot of their settings actually were never profitable at all, and never could have been. Yeah, what? Well, frankly, the cost of production was just too high compared to the price they were selling the settings for. Now, selling a product at a loss isn't an unheard of strategy, but I'm not really sure how it applies to this. I assume the logic was if people could get the core books, the expansions, at a decent price, TSR was expecting to supplement them with other purchases of other extended media, which they did sell at a profit. But the truth is, a lot of nerds don't do that. Some do, but not a lot. Once they get the core stuff, they're fine. Like, yeah, this isn't the type of model that's gonna work here. And it didn't. Dragon Dice in particular was a huge, huge force that was dragging them down, because dice are much more expensive to produce than cards like Magic was using. And again, Dragon Dice wasn't selling. No one wants the dice! Stop it! And another thing that was killing them was something called factoring. This was a weird element that, here's how it worked. TSR would arrange contracts with retailers in the hobby trade. Gaming stores, comic stores, whatever. The nerd shop. These contracts would allow those stores to pre-order the products and came with a discounted rate for contracts signed in January. TSR then took those contracts to the investment banks. The banks, based on the contracts, would advance TSR money immediately, which would then be paid off with eventual sales from the product. Now, this strategy did allow TSR to be paid in advance, basically. They would get the money that they were gonna get earlier, and they could budget with more certainty. But, not only did this lose them money from their profits because they had to pay the bank interest, losing roughly 18 cents for every dollar, this technique also was not very flexible when it came to changing market conditions. TSR was locked into their budget from January and really couldn't change it at all, causing them to absorb multiple losses throughout the year because they just didn't have the funds or hadn't budgeted for something sudden happening, which you'd think they would because that makes sense to do, but no, they just didn't do that. And remember that old, weird contract with Random House I mentioned earlier in the video? Well, TSR had started abusing that in a way that would let them sneak past and ignore short-term financial problems. Because TSR was being paid up front on the assumption that the shipped goods would sell, TSR would start getting sneaky and shipped overstock to Random House to generate loans on demand. Not only did TSR believe that those products inevitably sell and they didn't have to think about it, and to be clear, a lot of them didn't, and that led to overprinting of stuff that didn't sell, but Random House wasn't stupid and started noticing, hey, what are you doing? Because these numbers don't make... Wait a minute. And they would come back and demand that TSR shrink their debt load, which had reached $11.8 million by June of 1995. The following year, Random House would sue them for repayment. They were deep in debt by 96 and had very little cash in reserves. Random House then threw a bunch of unsold stock back in their faces, which was a lot of dragon dice actually, and charged them several $1 million. Random House, in fact, would return about $14 million worth of product between 95 and 97, and with no cash, TSR was unable to pay their printing and shipping bills, and thus their printer refused to do any more work because they couldn't pay them. The logistics company also had the production plates for key products like the core D&D books. That meant that there was no means of printing or shipping core products to generate income or secure short-term financing at all, and they would begin 1997 $30 million in debt. They were then threatened with lawsuits due to unpaid freelancers and missing a bunch of royalty payments, and in the end, the whole thing would have collapsed if not for Wizards of the Coast. See, Wizards, remember, was founded by a D&D fan. It was named after a guild of wizards from Dungeons & Dragons, and seeing TSR was on the brink of collapse, Wizards would step in, and Lorraine Williams opted to sell the company to them. Wizards would acquire TSR, and as part of the acquisition would completely settle all their debts. TSR products were able to be printed again, and they started reorienting TSR's assets in a way that actually made some sense. They moved to mend relations with some of TSR's former employees and contractors who had grown disillusioned and angry at them over the years, and they allowed artists to take back personal ownership of the original versions of art they had made for TSR. WotC would eventually close the TSR corporate offices in Lake Geneva, allowing the employees there to either transfer to Wizards of the Coast offices in Washington or let a few others work remotely. WotC did continue using the TSR name on D&D products for a further 3 years, and they started creating their own version of D&D, 3rd edition, being released in the year 2000. Though Wizards of the Coast by that point was purchased by Hasbro Incorporated, which they are still a subsidiary of now. To be clear, a lot of people say WotC is going to collapse. They make up half of Hasbro's income, so I'm not sure, unless they mismanage themselves into the ground, and there's something going on in the back doors, like, listen, we gotta, from a corporate perspective, I'm not sure that's really true. But anyway, when they do, I'll talk about it. I'm sure it'll be a great story. And as for Gen Con, well, in 2002, it was sold to Peter Atkinson, the original founder of WotC. Yeah, really. He's the current owner of it, in fact. And can we talk about this dude? This man was a nerd. Worked for Boeing, decided to strike out on his own, and named a new company after Dungeons & Dragons. Struck gold when he met Garfield and released Magic the Gathering. Was such a success that he was able to buy the very company that had been created to produce Dungeons & Dragons, which he liked so much that he named his own company after it. They buy that company, acquire Dungeons & Dragons, and then even after he leaves WotC, he proceeds to buy Gen Con, one of the most celebrated conventions in tabletop gaming history, and Atkinson really lived the nerd's dream when it comes to business up in here. Like, really? Till next time, this is Darkness, and I bid you all a fun farewell.